My name is Seneca Doty, and I'm an Aviation Studies and Spanish major at Bowling Green University. Because of these two areas of focus, I decided to entitle my project Aviation English in a Bilingual Context, with a specific focus on bilingual Spanish-English pilots. I've chosen my advisors Dr. Ducar from the World Language Department and Dr. Sheila from the Aviation Department for their unique skill set in each of these fields. Throughout my studies and acquiring my pilot's license, language has always intrigued me. To begin this presentation, I would like to explain how I combine these two areas of interest. In one of my aviation classes, we read through the accident report of an accident occurred in 1995 near Cali, Colombia. This accident was mainly attributed to a navigational error, which we discussed in the class. However, as we were reading through the accident report, I noticed a clear linguistic issue that had occurred and contributed to the accident, but we never discussed this within my class. I do not believe that this is a lack of teaching ability of my professor, instead a lack of overall knowledge about linguistics and aviation. I would like to show you what stood out to me from the report. The Cali controller told investigators that he was unable to understand the intent of the captain's request, thus he could not provide a meaningful answer and alleviate the captain's confusion. The controller explained that his communications with the captain were hindered by his lack of English fluency, which prevented him from determining the reason for the captain's question and providing the information the captain critically needed, that the approach began at Tulum and not at Roseau. In the stages leading up to the accident, the pilot had navigated to the wrong point, and the controller noticed that there was confusion in the navigational questions that the pilot was asking for clarification in. However, as stated in this report, the controller was unable to understand and hindered by his lack of English fluency, which led him to be unable to provide information the captain critically needed, leading to the death of 163 people. Unfortunately, this is not the only occurrence of language being an issue in aviation accidents. Over 1,000 fatalities have been attributed to the lack of English proficiency or misunderstandings due to inefficiency of cross-cultural communication. Even the deadliest aviation accident can be attributed in part to language. Although many factors played a role in the Tenerife, Spain accident of 1977, one of those contributing factors was the misuse of standard phraseology, and specifically the misuse of a preposition, which is one of the hardest aspects to learn in language acquisition. The Dutch pilot said "we are now at takeoff" rather than using the standard phraseology of taking off, which led the controller to believe that they were ready to take off, but not actually in the process of taking off. Instead, the plane was already barreling down the runway towards another aircraft that was still on the runway, leading to the death of 583 people. This small difference of saying "we are now at takeoff" rather than taking off led to the controller not being able to stop the accident before it occurred. In response to this accident, the Division of Aerospace reported that the dangers of non-standard or abbreviated clearances are clear. Maintaining clearance discipline under severe time constraints, however, is a constant struggle. As you can see, this report comes from 1978. However, most developments in the field of aviation linguistics are unfortunately much more recent. In 1951, the Chicago Conference established the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which is now the governing body for 192 member states. At this conference, they also established English as the official language of all radio telecommunications. This means that all radio communications between pilots and air traffic control must occur in English or at least be available in English. As you can see, much more recently, in 2003, the International Civil Aviation Organization established standards of proficiencies, which we will discuss later in the presentation. They gave the member states until 2008 for them to comply by the standards, and the countries were left on their own to develop their own training practices and testing procedures. The ICAO language proficiency standards are based on pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, and interactions, and pilots are rated at different levels starting at pre-elementary, elementary, pre-operational, operational, extended, and expert. As you can see, level 4 is listed here because it is one of the most important in determining a pilot's proficiency, as pilots are required to test at a level 4 proficiency before they are allowed to test for their student pilot's license or allowed to receive solo clearances. Level 4 proficiencies are very important when conducting international flights. Native speakers are not required to test, unless they have an accent that impedes understanding. Based on documents released by governing agencies, there have been studies that have evaluated the standards themselves, their implementation within different countries, as well as how this relates to pilot proficiencies. However, most of these studies have focused on a specific language or region. They have evaluated radio conversations between pilots and air traffic control and found that the testing and training implementation have been problematic. My focus on this project was to expound on previous research and expand the field of study into the Spanish language. Throughout my study, I was able to acquire 23 participants who spoke Spanish as a native language and spoke English. They had varying levels of experience both in aviation as well as Spanish, and represented countries such as France, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Costa Rica, the United States, including Puerto Rico, and Mexico. I was able to contact these participants using a snowball effect. The research questions for this study focused on how does exposure to English influence a pilot's level of self-efficacy of English proficiencies in the cockpit. How do language proficiencies and exposure relate to self-efficacy toward proficiencies in specific flight contexts? And with what frequency are pilots exposed to their native language while performing aviation duties, and what effect does this have on their ability to perform their duties? My survey was offered in both Spanish and English, to not limit it to those who didn't feel comfortable taking the survey in English. I used a 6-point Likert scale as seen below and asked pilots to respond to how comfortable they felt in certain flight situations. I also asked them demographic questions to relate these responses to their aviation experience as well as their language experience. My first research question was how does exposure to English influence a pilot's level of self-efficacy of English proficiencies in the cockpit? It is notable that 26% of these respondents learned English for the specific purpose of aviation. Here you can see that for one of the questions, the pilots were asked to respond to the prompt, I speak English, and then respond with very well, a little, or not well. As you can see here, one respondent replied a little, and this respondent also rated lowest on the Likert scales, being more likely to respond that they were only slightly comfortable or moderately comfortable in certain flight scenarios related to English. Also notable was the difference here between I speak English and I speak aviation English in the answers to each prompt. As you can see, one person responded that they speak English a little, while this answer is eliminated during I speak aviation English. This can be related back to the Cali-Columbia accident and emergency situations in general. When asked if they speak aviation English, all of the pilots responded well or very well, while there was only one respondent that indicated that they spoke English a little. Although there is only one respondent who replied a little when asked how well they spoke English, it isn't critical to understand that this difference can be a contributing factor to accidents occurring within the field, as the Cali-Columbia controller wasn't able to report to the pilots their critical information because of a lack of English proficiency in general. Listed here are the results of where pilots that completed the survey had learned English, with results ranging from high school, university, at home, aviation training, church, and other. When asked whether they use English outside of the workplace, 35% of the respondents replied sometimes, and 13% replied never, leaving 48% of participants that have little to no experience with English outside of aviation. How does language proficiencies and exposure relate to self-efficacy towards proficiencies in specific flight contexts? When pilots were asked, was there ever a time where you didn't speak up because you couldn't say what you wanted to in English? While 65% responded no, there were still 35% that had experienced a situation in which they couldn't communicate information based on their English proficiency. Also, when asked, has your language proficiency ever caused a lack of situational awareness? 83% responded no, but 17% responded yes. Of these 17%, they were more likely to be less experienced with English overall. They more commonly reported being slightly comfortable or moderately comfortable, which was at the lower end of responses within the Likert scale. They also tended to prefer Spanish in the cockpit, and many had experienced flight lessons conducted in Spanish rather than in English. They were also more likely to report that they sometimes or never use English outside of the workplace. This shows that using English outside of the workplace or having more experience with English in general can relate to how comfortable pilots feel inside of the cockpit. While only 4 participants responded that they had experienced a lack of situational awareness due to language proficiency, this is still an important number in an attempt to mitigate all risk factors related to a lack of language proficiency. Relating to my third research question, with what frequency are pilots exposed to their native language while performing aviation duties, and what effect does this have on their ability to perform duties? While placards and checklists are provided in English, almost half of pilots participate their native language while inside of the cockpit. In addition, 96% of respondents stated that they at some point have heard Spanish over the radio. This doesn't take into consideration pilot-to-pilot interactions, only pilot-to-air traffic controller interactions. These statistics show that Spanish and the use of other languages are very present in aviation. While developing the survey, I also developed interview questions that were intended to elaborate on responses and acquire qualitative data in addition to the quantitative data from the survey I already conducted. This interview could be used to understand specific situations in which language proficiency has caused errors in situational awareness and understand how bilingual or multilingual pilots interpret situations. As stated previously, after the release of the ICAO standards, each country was left to its own implementation process, with some working better than others. A study could be done to evaluate the different implementation of ICAO standards in various countries. An evaluation could be done of these different implementations of the ICAO standards in various countries and how this affects different pilots' proficiencies within those countries. It would also be very beneficial to study how pilots react in emergency situations and which language the pilots process these high-stress scenarios in. Which language they use could be connected to proficiencies in order to better improve testing and training procedures in the future. After conducting this research, I have developed an understanding of the importance of linguistics in aviation and plan to continue my research, as well as study applied linguistics and go into the field of aviation linguistics in the future. From previous research, as well as my own contribution, I have found that even after the implementation of standards, lack of language proficiency still exists at all levels of aviation and poses a significant risk factor to safe aircraft operations. Acquiring language from a source outside of aviation or having experience using English outside of the aviation workplace can lead to a higher comprehension of language overall and a higher level of presumed proficiency. Due to the hazard misuse of language presents, studies should continue to be conducted and education on this issue must be increased.